Hello and welcome to the Chicken Neck Podcast. Supported by the Idea Brews Network, we are a bunch of curious individuals based out of the Northeast, and we strive to bring you the best of policy discussions through the intersection with things that affect your and our daily lives. If you like what we do, show your support by sharing our work. Don't forget to leave your comments on this episode in our social media handles. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Chicken Neck Podcast. It's been quite a while since we released our last episode, and we are actually glad to be back. Our guest today is Samrat Choudhary, who is a journalist and author from Shillong. Samrat and I go a little back where we first met at a conference which spoke about issues around Northeast. So Amrat has been an editor of broadsheet newspapers in Delhi, Mumbai, and Bengaluru, and as an author and a journalist, has had his very diverse experience of working in very different areas. Some of which, of course, includes a lot of literary, experience. He has been the editor of several books. He has, in fact, written a travelogue following the course of the Brahmaputra called The Braided River. He has also written a novel called The Urban Jungle, which was published by the very renowned Penguin Books in 2011 and was nominated for the Man Asian Literary Prize. Apart from this, Samraj is also a columnist and writes often in some of the leading newspapers around the country. But our discussion today with Samrat is about his most recent work, the Northeast India Political History, a book that he came up with last year, if I'm not wrong, Samrat,
Yeah.
and which has actually stirred up quite a interest because when I was looking into different websites which showed some of the most relevant books about Northeast, your book was up there in the top two in every website that I looked into.
Oh, wow.
So on that note, welcome to the Chicken Neck Podcast, Samrat.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on your show.
It's to start off, since we've just Animesh also brought up your book, and we were really curious when we were going through it, and we were very lucky to receive a copy from you itself before the episode. So it was really nice getting to go through the book. Could you tell us a bit about your book, the idea behind it, and the entire process? Because to write articles and columns and to write something of a book, especially on Northeast India, and to cover such a wide range of stories and topics is a really interesting process. So could you just take us through the process and what went around in writing the book?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, journalism is a whole other kettle of fish, and writing books is completely different. And actually, I kind of stumbled into it, you can say. I mean, I meandered into it. It was my work on my previous book, the Brahmaputra book, which led basically to this. And I had stumbled into that one as well. I met Preeti Gill, who is a former publisher and had just been turned literary agent at a conference in Jamia, where I was not even presenting a paper, and we ended up having a tea break discussion where it turned out that she was looking for somebody to write a book on the Brahmaputra, and at that time I was living in Bombay, and so I was very excited at the thought of being able to do such a book, but I didn't know if I could actually do it. So I thought about it for a few days, and then eventually I was tempted to say yes, and I took the task on, and I started going back to the Northeast. I had left after my 12th standard, exams, and studied outside and worked outside for many years, and so I had in some sense lost my touch with the issues. I had written journalistically from time to time, but my deeper engagement with the region actually happened because of the research and the traveling that I did as I started researching my Brahmaputra book. And that's when it sort of actually came together. And the material that I gathered, some of that sparked some ideas, some of that remained with me. I put together a small library of my own, and that eventually fed into this book. And this book also happened in some sense by chance, because after I finished my Brahmaputra manuscript, what had happened was that uh, I the publisher who was originally interested in the project had by then somehow lost interest in the project. So I had a whole manuscript and had traveled thousands of kilometers. Well, I mean, not thousands, but several. I'd been there several times, so I suppose I could say that. And here I was with a manuscript and years of work and no publisher. But at that time, I by chance ended up getting a Chevening fellowship, and so I was in London, and I got in touch with Hearst Publishers. And even though they didn't take the Brahmaputra book at that point in time, eventually the conversations and connections led to this book, the Northeast India Political History, being sort of written. So it was a series of coincidences and chance encounters that led to this book being written and published.
Just to follow up on that, and this is question more out of curiosity. I'm sure somebody who wants to write or wants to work around that area might have that question. So I wanted to ask, because I saw your work, one of your work, for instance, the first novel was you wrote a novel, then you wrote a travelogue, and then of course now you're coming up with a literature which is in many ways a history of the region, both, I mean, history in the traditional sense and also the contemporary events, contemporary events as well. So, as somebody who writes in different areas, right? Because normally we see if somebody is writing about history, they tend to write about history. How challenging is it, and how do you get into that process of writing from, shifting from writing a novel to a travelogue to something of a historical piece? How do you do that?
Well, I mean, I am not a specialist, and I don't consider myself an expert on anything except perhaps to some extent journalism. But the thing about journalism is that when we do journalism, we are forced to engage with different subjects on different days. It's just part of the job. And so, a large part of my journalism experience actually was doing special features for the Hindustan Times, where I spent several years. And it could be, one week I was writing about, uh, one week, I might be following the election trail in some state. I've been on the election trail in Uttar Pradesh, in Bihar, and elsewhere. Another week you might be in the Northeast or in Kashmir. Another week you might be, writing about food, and some other time you might be writing about something. Like I remember covering a hockey match, India Pakistan hockey match. So if you could end up doing just about anything, whatever it was that fell to you that week, you did. And the intimidation that one feels about not knowing is something that you're forced to overcome, because that's the nature of the job. So you go in saying that I don't know, but at the same time you know that you have to do it, and you know that it has to come out in the paper in 2 days time.
Right.
And so I would go in with the feeling that I don't know, but also with the feeling that, well, I mean, I have to do it, and so I will do it.
One last follow up with respect to that, because when I was reading your book, another very interesting facet of the book was understanding that while you had written so much, and especially with respect to some states, for instance, the chapter on Nagaland, which we will speak about on Tripura as well, there were events which were connected to what is happening in the current time as well. And one very interesting thing was that I felt was that you stuck to the facts, and it was very rarely where I would see that you had given an opinion on what is happening, right? So how challenging is it to write a book where you are not really giving your opinion, in spite of you being from that region, having lived there, having researched there for this book as well? So how do you delineate that process of putting in opinions and consciously not putting in opinions?
It was my journalistic training. In journalism, the basic training is that you don't report opinions. The space for opinion is separate from the space for narrating facts, as far as we are able to discern them.
Right.
We may fail in that effort, but at
Right.
least the effort should be to honestly and accurately report the facts. So, what I was trying over here was basically to just lay out a simple chronology in a certain geography, and to look at how that the present political boundaries came to be formed, present political identities came to be formed. So I was not looking at at reporting at expressing my own opinions. In fact, I was very consciously trying to keep my opinion out of it and to use standard sources as far as possible, to just put the bare bones facts out there as far as one can discern them. There may be disagreements between different groups or different writers on different facts. In such cases, I've tried to represent as far as possible those differences as well, so that there are different views on that. I've tried to represent in wherever possible.
While going through your book, one thing that really caught my attention as well was the way you title the chapters very interestingly. Each chapter has a very interesting and unique title, and that actually makes the reader very curious regarding what it is about. The first chapter, for example, is called Tea Christianity and Modernity in Entering India and the Modern World. On that note, Northeast India has a major Christian concentration in India,
Right.
and especially with regards to, if we see the way the Christian population is divided in India, part of it is in the coastal areas, and the rest is majorly based in the northeast. So however, in one thing that is unique to our region when it comes, or to northeast India when it comes to the Christian population, as is that it is a modern phenomenon which has happened in mostly in the 20th century. So, could you tell us about what were the changes that went through, and how this thing came to be, and how this population grew in the last 150 years, and the major developments that took place in this regard?
Well, I mean, the advent of the missionaries was very important in the formation of present political identities throughout the Northeast. I mean, starting with Assam itself and the Baptist Mission Press, which had a sizable impact. Uh, Not in the religious sense, but in the linguistic sense. It had a role. If you look at the basic theory of how languages are sort of standardized, the standardization of languages, and so they had been impactful not just in one state, in several states. It was similar in the case of Meghalaya also, and in other states as well. So that was one part of the impact. Coming to the question of religion itself, the growth of Christianity. Now, in the Northeast, if you speak about the Christian population, basically you are talking about Nagaland, Mizoram, and Meghalaya, which are the three Christian majority states, and overwhelmingly so in the case of Nagaland and Mizoram. And then you're looking at the hill areas of Manipur, and you're looking at Arunachal Pradesh also, parts of Arunachal Pradesh. So it's not all the states, it's the hills. And interestingly, I mean, not uniformly in every case, but say for example in the case of Nagaland and also in the case of Mizoram, uh, now those areas were places where British administration entered only in the late years of the 1800s. So it's only in the towards the end of the 1800s that we find British administration extending up into the Naga Hills and into the Lushai Hills and so on. And before that, you still have the period of expeditions and raids and counter raids and so on. So it's after 1890 or 1890 late 1890s, that that an administration is established which makes it possible for the missionaries to extend their their activities in those areas. uh, the process, I think, the in the case of Mizoram at least, the process is very clear. It's basically that you see the numbers, and the numbers go up very sharply from approximately 1900 to 1941. In the case of Mizoram, the number of Christians in 1901 was 45 people only, and it rose to almost a lakh, which was at that time more than 60% of the population by 1941. So basically you have a major growth in the first 4 decades of the 20th century. So it's basically, I would say that the growth of the Christian population is something which happened with the extension of British administration, And even though the British administrators and the missionaries were often at loggerheads with each other, but it was somehow a process that they went hand in hand. And because the extension of British administration into some of those hills happened quite late in the day, so therefore it was towards the end of British rule that we saw that period of explosive growth in the number of Christians.
I think, and when you talk about tea, so this idea of Christianity, rise in Christianity and tea, and the Britishers coming into and sort of in trying to push. Was there a certain push? I mean, a lot of literature that we tend to read also talks about this push for Christianity because of the spread of commercialization around this area. Has Is there a relation between that as well?
What I remember, coming across is basically uh, accounts of British administrators where they are somehow uh, not so happy with the missionaries. And of course, so I mean, there would be individual British officers who were very, religious and might have therefore been very keen on extending the work of the missions. But there were also a lot of British administrators who were uh, not, not happy with the missions. And again, going back to Mizoram, that is something that we find in the accounts of the British administrators, where
Right.
basically you'll see that they're saying that the mission is sort of taking on the most powerful role in a certain sense, that our administration does not extend so far into the interiors, but they have a lot of influence in the villages and so on and so forth. And so it is not a so it is not a process which would have been uniformly encouraged by the British. In fact, right from the beginning of British rule, initially the East India Company had decided to not allow missionary activity, which is why the missionaries were based out of Srirampur,
Right.
which was a uh, not a British settlement, because they were not allowed to operate in British areas.
Right.
And of course, that policy changed subsequently, and then they started coming in. But uh, it's I think it's a it's a complicated picture, where at some points during the British rule, some administrators encouraged the missionaries. In
Right.
some places they encouraged the missionaries, but sometimes they fought with each other. In the case of Assam, the American Baptist mission and the British administrators were often at loggerheads. So it was not a uniform process.
Right. I mean, that also reminds me as to how even during the expansion of this earlier, the Brahmaputra Valley in Assam, how they were at loggerheads with how to go about. So I think it was also a very evolving thought process for them politically and maybe later, religiously as to whether push for these things or not, which also on a large scale depended on the person who was in charge of this entire area. So maybe, yeah, maybe that is how this has played in. But one of the things that your book also reflected was the once the northeastern part was in a way incorporated into the modern idea of India, there were a lot of states in the northeastern part, which was initially, of course, part of Assam. However, given the socio-political setup that had developed post throughout the British era, the different influences they had with respect to putting people in a particular geography and the different commercial aspects to their colonization, there was a lot of spread of independent minded hill people around this area, which led to, of course, partition of a different sort within the structure, breakdown of Assam into different states. But within those states that were formed as well, one of its which is contemporarily very relevant, which is Manipur, the aspect of low and high lying individuals, communities, the Metis and the Cookies, of course, led to a lot of conflict. So, could you take us through, because you have a very nice chapter where you talk about the Manipur's princes and rebels and how there was a whole attempt at assimilating it through the ages. Because I also ask this in context to the fact that I remember reading a portion of the British says initial attempt to colonize this part of the world, where once they had actually taken the Brahmaputra Valley, where essentially the Ahom kingdoms, while they were exploiting the Ahom kingdoms because it was weak, they had actually given a lot of power to the Manipuri kings because the Manipuri king was strategically very important, right? So could you take us through, and you have also I think mentioned it initially in your book. So could you take us through a bit of that and how the all of these colonial aspects have actually played a larger role in how the conflict lies in Manipur today?
Okay. So well, I mean, it is what you mentioned, which is the existence of state-like structures in the lowlands and of independent-minded hill people in the highlands. And in the case of Manipur, there is a very ancient history of state formation, of the process of state formation, which dates back to about 33 AD. And I mainly drew my references of that very early history of Manipur from the English translation of the Royal Chronicles, the Chaitharol Kumpapa, by Saroj Nalini Arambam Parat, and the works of another Manipuri historian, Rajkumar Jhalajit Singh, who also used the Chaitharol Kumpapa as his source. And so for that part, what I'll do is I'll read from the book itself, because I don't want to uh, misquote the authors, the original authors. And so, what uh, Jhalajit Singh says is that uh, the story starts with a battle between Pakhangba, who was the first king, and a Shan invader from Burma who had established himself in what is now Imphal. For some reason not yet known, the throne of the principality, which came to be known as Ningthauja Principality from 33 AD onwards, fell vacant in the spring of that year, writes Singh. A man named Pakhangba had distinguished himself as a warrior. Pakhangba fought for the throne with Poraiton and thoroughly defeated him in a decisive battle. He seized all his weapons and the women who came in his horde. So after he ascends the throne of the Ningthauja Principality, which was then one of seven in the plains of Manipur, Pakhangba sets about consolidating his rule, and he marries the vanquished Poraiton's sister, Laisna, and the first territorial expansion of the Ningthauja Principality begins from there on. Continues in the reign of his grandson, Tauthing Mang, who conquered a few villages in the valley. But it takes a long time. It's a process which takes about 500 years before the Ningthaujas are finally able to defeat the neighboring principality of the Angoms and realize tributes from them. So basically, there is a process which goes through centuries of internal consolidation and and state formation, where the different Meitei clans are eventually united into one Meitei kingdom in the valley. And there are records in the Chaitharol Kumpapa uh, of conflicts with others which start to pop up, and from fairly early in the day. So they record conflicts with people in the hills. They There are subsequent records of conflicts with people who are referred to as Mayangs, and which would basically imply people from the plains, probably of nearby Sylhet or Kachar. And so we find those records of conflicts. Uh, it's uh, it's only basically uh, the arrival of modern ideas of state and territory, which you have periods where the relations are good, periods where the relations are not so good between different groups. Uh, we must not forget the Burmese influence as well, because the kingdom becomes very powerful. The Manipur kingdom becomes very powerful in the reign of King Garib Nawaz, and who attacks Burma several times, successfully attacks Burma several times. But then he also, ironically for someone who bears that name, becomes a very uh, devout and conservative Hindu, and also ends up offending followers of the Sanamahi, traditional Sanamahi faith. And so there is a religious tension within Manipur towards the end of his reign, the king himself is killed by his own son, and a period of instability follows in Manipur. And at that time, meanwhile, Burma has become very powerful, and the Burmese then start to attack, and eventually, it's basically the Burmese rule of both the Manipur and the Ahom kingdoms, and subsequent intervention by the British, the Anglo Burmese War, and after that colonial rule. So that's the basic timeline. Now, it's after the coming of colonial rule and essentially of modernity that we start to have these, these current ideas of notions of identity and territory that we have now. And coming to the present conflict, which you mentioned, my view of it is that it is born out of those modern notions of identity and territory. Because basically, the way I see the conflict is I see it as a conflict of clashing nationalisms. And so you have certain Manipuri nationalism, you have a Naga nationalism pre-existing, and that is something which is, which is something which the government of India, for example, has been having peace talks for some, decades now, with the groups. And you also have so you had in the past a larger uh, idea of a Mizo nationalism, and so there is a sort of a Mizo slash Zomi nationalism also. There have been insurgent groups which have fought on behalf of these nationalisms for many years now, and the government of India has had arrangements with several of these groups over the years, uh, peacemaking arrangements, and so you got a situation where there are conflicting ideas of territory, overlapping maps, and these identities with their armed groups behind them. So it is, in a sense, a very difficult conflict to resolve.
Right, and I think what is also interesting is that towards the end of that chapter on Manipur, and I think I, I can guess that you had sort of completed this manuscript before the tensions in Manipur had started. So you essentially there talk about the problems that might cause as a result of the tensions that already exist. So which is also another very interesting take on how history can and all in a way, and the settlements can in a way create problems with how they exist or coexist at a particular point of time. So that I also found very interesting with your book. But yeah, I think that that point is very interesting when you say as to how traditionally, although they were a community, a very old community in fact, but through migration and through different aspects, historical migration, there has been a lot of issues that have developed, even with the role of the neighboring states as well. But from that to, I'd like to jump from that to the aspect of Nagaland, because you mentioned Mizoram as well. And while we'll not ask you to every time explain the larger context, because I know it's also very difficult for you to remember all the context of what we are trying to say. But you also talk about Nagaland and the Naga rebellion in great detail when it comes to when it comes to Nagaland in your book. And while we'd like to give you a very, I mean, we'd like for you to give us a very brief outline of what this rebellion was. My question largely also revolves around the aspect towards the end of of your chapter on Nagaland, where you talk about how the BJP actually played, came to power in Nagaland, and then because you very interestingly say that the BJP through its power in the center and through the deep pockets they come to power in the state, and however, do you think that the Naga peace accord had a large role when it came to bringing BJP in the state? And how do you think that in a state like Nagaland, BJP could essentially establish some sort of a voter base when because traditionally these parties were not really very successful in the states in Northeast.
I don't think, well, I mean, they're not really in power, but they are definitely a part of the power structure. And
Sorry, I mean they you mentioned the 12 seats where they won, not in
yeah,
power, but
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. And I think in the hills of Northeast India, at least, the expansion of the BJP may have less to do with ideological reasons and more to do with practical reasons. And for some of these places, apart from very very practical concerns such as the issue of which, where the money comes from, who disburses the funds uh, at the center. Apart from that, it's basically a question of dealing with whichever is the central authority, whoever is the central authority in Delhi. And so you'd find a pattern which has been repeated over the years uh, of some of these states having uh, very strong sort of alignment with whichever party is in power in the center. So, for example, say in the case of Arunachal, as long as the Congress was in power in the center, the state was solidly a Congress state, and subsequently, almost the entire Congress became the BJP. So, uh, so I think we can't see that in ideological terms. I think that should just be seen in very practical terms as necessities of political survival for the practitioners of that profession.
right, and could you, I mean, in a very brief manner, talk us through the Naga rebellion as to what is the importance of that rebellion when it comes to the state? Because I mean, your chapter sort of traces it right from independence, and how the idea of statehood and how they wanted to be a different independent
Yeah.
place altogether. So could you take us
Yeah.
very briefly through that part?
Well, I mean, the Naga argument from the beginning was that they were never a part of any Indian kingdom or empire. That in essence, that they had always been independent, and uh, so the initial representations also to, for example, the Simon Commission, which is often referred to, brought up the fact that they were also culturally distinct, and they had their unique culture and identity, and it was distinct from that of the uh, in religious terms of the Hindus on one side and the Muslims on the other, which was relevant in those times because uh, after all, you were heading towards a partition on religious lines, Hindu and Muslim. And so that sense of a distinct identity and a different distinct culture and a distinct territory which was linked to that distinct identity was always there for from the beginnings of the modern political consciousness, where it can be traced. And I think even at the time of before independence, uh, there were strong voices saying that we don't really want to be a part of a future Indian or Pakistani state. That we should be able to decide our own future essentially. So Fizo was active before independence as well, and the I've started my chapter by mentioning the telegram which never reached, which was sent one day before the independence of India, saying that that they wanted to remain independent. Uh, so that idea was always there for quite a long time, and uh, while it probably did not have universal support, but it did at some points enjoy quite widespread support. Uh, that sense changed over the years, and probably initially the real fighting happened in the early days, in the late 1950s and 60s, before the formation of Nagaland state, which was the first state to be carved out of Assam. uh, it was basically a political way to appease and integrate uh, within the Indian Union, that struggle for independence, and I think it has been largely successful. It has been to a great extent successful because the kind of conflict that existed then gradually petered out. And while the issue is not finally laid to rest, because we have a framework agreement which has been signed but not the final agreement between the contending parties, but nonetheless there has been substantial progress over the years since the time when uh, there was open warfare for a free Nagaland.
Uh, I mean, again, that's a very interesting insight into how all of this led to what it is currently. And but moving from that to also, because there are so many different aspects to your book, it's actually very difficult to jump from one point to another. But other very interesting aspect is where you bring up the aspect of Sikkim. And what I found very interesting was that you say your chapter is named Sikkim and the completion of region making. So my first question, of course, would be why do you call it the completion of region making? I mean, also from the aspect of was it regards to the modern Northeast as we know it, and of course, also with that, I would like to know of your views on why initially do you think Sikkim was not pushed as a part because it was part of the British protectorate, and could you tell us as to why it later became a part in 1975 and not, and why also do you call it the completion of region making?
Well, precisely because it was not a part of the country until 1975. So it was also not really geographically, it is separated from the other states of the region. It
Correct.
doesn't have geographical contiguity with the region. Normally, you think of a region, you think of places which are together,
Right.
contiguous to one another. But Sikkim is not. And historically, also, it had a different trajectory to its history all through. Uh, Culturally, also, it was fairly distinct from several of the other areas and states in the Northeast. So it has always been a bit different from the other states of the Northeast. Even now, I think it's the eighth sister in more ways than one. The seven sister states all have a certain closeness which Sikkim does not seem to share with the rest. Uh, so its inclusion eventually, as an official part of the region in the Northeast Council, a belated inclusion, was what in some sense made it, completed the region making in my idea, because I see the Northeast as an official region, not so much a historical region, with all these eight states. And uh, so Sikkim is the outlier, definitely, which sort of makes it, that part of that official region, and the completion of region making happens with its inclusion. Uh, what was your other question about the historical process by which it became a part of India?
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
also the fact that they were a protectorate initially. So
right.
why I mean, of course, there was a long political battle, but I just wanted you to speak a little bit on based on your research as to on that.
So the status of Sikkim as a princely state was similar before 1975 to other princely states before 1947 in some ways, because uh, it remained a princely state until then. And it was not the only princely state in that part of the world. You also have its neighbor Bhutan to think about, with which kingdom Sikkim had old ties. Their royal families were related to each other, and perhaps naturally, the royal families in both places had similar aspirations, which were clearly stated by their rulers at different times, which was essentially that they wanted to remain independent in terms of their internal affairs, and to remain under protection of first of the British Indian Empire, and then of its successor Indian state. And Bhutan was able to successfully achieve this goal, but Sikkim eventually could not retain that level of independence and became a part of India. I think I would argue that it was not 1975 but 1971 when the die was cast, because that was the year when the Bangladesh war happened, as a result of which Pakistan split in two, and East Pakistan became Bangladesh, and as the victor in a war in which India had prevailed despite opposition from, despite, yes, open opposition to some extent from the Americans. Uh, so it was, for a while, it was in a position where it could redraw maps, which is what happened right then. So the map of the entire region got redrawn, and it was a region which geographically, the bounds of that region are the Himalayas in the north and the Bay of Bengal in the south. And so within that region, a lot of maps got redrawn. So the entire map of Northeast India also got redrawn at that time. And so the reorganization of Northeast India happened. Bangladesh emerges on the map. Bhutan becomes, it's a crucial year for Bhutan also. Bhutan becomes a UN member, probably with support from uh, Western backing, and so its independence becomes secure. And Sikkim, however, is not able to achieve that, uh, because Sikkim started not immediately but soon after to have problems. The king of Sikkim wanted to get what the king of Bhutan had got, and so the king of Sikkim wants a renegotiation of the Indo-Sikkimese friendship treaty. But what happens instead is that Indira Gandhi, fresh from victory in war, tasks Ramnath Kao, the celebrated spy master of India, with doing something in the matter. And so 2 years later, elections happened in Sikkim, internal elections in Sikkim. Sikkim had a state council at the time. And in the Sikkim elections, the Sikkim's King's party, basically the national party, wins 9 out of the 18 seats and is the single largest party. But but protests break out against alleged rigging, unfairness in the electoral processes, and the protests become very intense. And eventually, the king finds himself besieged and unable to control the situation and has to appeal to India for help. And then Indian help arrives, and uh, fresh elections are held, organized by the Indian Election Commission, which the opposition to the Sikkim king wins handsomely. And then subsequently a referendum happens, which is a referendum to join India, and which votes overwhelmingly in favor of joining India. And so, by very democratic and largely peaceful methods, Sikkim is integrated into India.
Right. I mean, as unique as that story with respect to Sikkim is, and the fact that it was one of those princely states which came in later, like you mentioned, another very interesting story is that of Tripura, and I think I was mentioning the other colleagues at the podcast as well that the Tripura chapter personally was an eye opener, and the reason for this was that, and it has also a bit of contemporary relevance as well, because now we see that the government is focusing a lot on Tripura with respect to infrastructure, because it's sort of the last place when it comes to its connectivity with Bangladesh. But before the partition, I could sense that there is a route. There used to be a route of for trade, and I think that in a way might have influence, which I know from you, of course, more on the history and on impact of history and politics in the state. Now, would you then say that the kind of political history or the economic history or the problems whatever has existed in the state has to do with the fact that it had greater connectivity, and somehow that connectivity was hampered over the years due to partition? And also, just to add on to that, maybe the fact of immigration and migration, an issue that has existed in Assam or in some other states over time in Northeast. Uh, is this somewhere, do you feel that this issue is more visible with regards to Tripura, or over the years, Tripura has been shown as this, as a political example, not
Yeah.
necessarily, let's say, as what has existed, but as a political example by the political class in different states, saying, oh, this is what has happened and this might happen to you. So that fear factor. Do you
Yeah.
think Tripura is an example that has been there, that has been used over the years? Could you tell us about that a bit?
Sure. So, so basically, I think we have to think about it in terms of uh, a slightly longer span of history. And what I said a little while ago, that the geography, the geographical boundaries, the natural boundaries, if you think about them, are the Himalayas in the north and the Bay of Bengal in the south. Now, within this region, people have been moving back and forth for throughout history. There has been there has been movement of human populations, large, small, throughout. In fact, the Brahmaputra was the ancient highway of that entire region, and the rivers were the main highways by which people moved. And so, movement of people is something which has been happening for centuries, and it has happened from other directions as well. For example, uh, the Ahoms came from the other direction, from across the Patkai Hills. So movement is something which has been going on for centuries, and where there were not any major geographical barriers to their movement, the scale of movement would naturally have been greater. So, coming back to Tripura and the question of Tripura, uh, we find, for example, that the uh, both the royal chronicles of Tripura and accounts of historians talk about arguably the first historical, as opposed to mythical figure, a first historical ruler of the Manikya dynasty as Ratnafa. That is something which is oftenly said. He was definitely the first to bear the title of Manikya, by which the kings are known to this day, and that was a title which, according to Alexander Mackenzie, was given to him by by the Nawab of Gaur. So basically, what we find is, I'll just read from what Alexander Mackenzie wrote. He mentions that Ratnafa was a younger son of the Tripura king, and therefore not in direct line of succession, who obtained the throne with the help of 4,000 Mohammedan troops lent to him by the king of Gaur. And this is happening around 1279 AD. And then, after securing the throne, Ratnafa, according to the royal chronicles of Tripura, gifted the king of Gaur elephants and sought in exchange people from the nine essential castes. So basically, what is happening in 750 years ago is that the king of Tripura is now the new king of Tripura is asking for labor. Essentially, he's asking for skilled the immigration or migration of skilled labor from Bengal into the kingdom of Tripura. So it is something which happens at the very inception of the modern state, or the state structure there. It's not something which is new in that sense. Uh, in subsequent years, the kingdom of Tripura, sometimes it's larger, sometimes it's smaller. Its territorial boundaries extend or contract depending on the power of the ruling rulers at that time, and the power of its neighbors. Uh, at some point, early 1700s, the Mughals come to capture the areas of Tripura which are in the plains, which are the fertile areas where a lot of the agriculture happens, and those areas come to be known as Chakla Roshnabad. And the king of Tripura remains the zamindar of those areas, but no more the king. So he is king in the hills, but in the adjoining plains, he is now a zamindar, and he is paying tribute to the whoever the ruler is. And that is where the British find it. So then we find that in the British accounts, the British are saying that this is how we found it and this is how we kept it. So, so Chakla Roshnabad continues as a sort of part of Tripura. In the British maps, it's mentioned as Tipera, Tippera or TipperaH, right? And the hill state is Hill Tipera. So, so the name is same, and there is a distinction of topography. And uh, this continues until 1947, essentially, even though the names have changed before that. But what has happened, what happens then is that now you have a situation where you are going to draw international boundaries where no international boundaries previously existed. And of course, after that, there is a huge migration of people, not immediately in 1947. It actually happens in subsequent years because of riot after riot, and there is a mass migration that happens, and the demographic balance changes. Now, demographic balance changing is something which, when you did not have democracy, was not so important. But by then you have electoral democracy and everybody is counting numbers, and having a majority means being powerful, whereas that was not the case when the kings were ruling, because you would, it didn't matter who was a majority or a minority. What mattered was whether you were a noble or a royal family or a commoner. And so now you have this situation where you have a democratic politics coming in, and the numbers have become important. Censuses have come, so numbers are being counted, and everybody is getting to see what those numbers are. And the anxieties about politics and representation, competitive politics, all begin. So what we then see is the modern politics of uh, of anxieties about immigration, anxieties about majorities and minorities, and of course about representation, which continue, and it has definitely a very distinct sort of difference between the politics in the tribal areas and in the non-tribal areas.
Right. I mean, it's very unique how all of this, because we also had we had a few episodes which talked about partition in general, in sorry, in particular, and it also in a way on very similar lines to what you had mentioned. Of course, I mean, although we did not look too much into the historical aspect of it, starting from Mughals, but from post the British era, it was very interesting, and they resonated almost the same thoughts as you as to how this. This so-called the zamindari system, and later the drawing of partition lines suddenly caused a lot of problems around that region in Tripura, and which again coming back to the aspect of this entire the problem that exists with regards to language even in Tripura with respect to the Bengali speaking and non-Bengali speaking, and of late the whole Tripura movement that had started
Yeah,
in Tripura. So that
yeah,
also has a lot of significance with what has happened to what you just mentioned. And if anything you'd like to add to that, along with my question with regards to Assam as well, because your of all the chapters, your chapter on Assam has the most unique title where you say you talk about the politics of representation, and I
right.
correlate this to the question on Tripura because, like I said, that Tripura is almost sometimes used as this example of of threat where they say that this might
Yeah,
happen. So,
yeah,
and why did you think of? I mean, I understand the idea behind using the word representation when it comes to Assam, but how do you look at this aspect of representation and of migration in Assam? Because I think that the reasons for migration in Assam were almost similar. It was Britishers who brought in a lot of people
yeah,
to work here, and also the fact that a lot of Bengali speaking people had migrated because of problems that they faced after migration or after partition. So
yeah.
how do you correlate both these examples, and would you like to, through your experience of this research and writing this book, would you like to share your inputs on this particular issues?
Yeah. So, as far as the name of the chapter is concerned, actually, what I was thinking of at that time was the chronology. So, the name, the politics of representation in the case of that chapter, which happens to be the chapter on Assam, is because the first assembly in the whole of Northeast was the Shillong assembly in what was then the capital of Assam, and that was the time when you were seeing the emergence of the politics of representation nationally, not
Right.
just there, but because I focused on that region, so I spoke about that part of the world. But so I was actually thinking about representative politics as a whole making an entry, the first elections, and the first assembly being formed, and the first governments being formed, which happened before 1947. I'm talking about 1937 and so on. So it's that in that aspect that I meant the politics of representation. Uh, as far as migration is concerned, the issue of migration is concerned, it cannot be disentangled from the question of the drawing of borders, as as you've also said. So the drawing of those borders has been momentous for uh, for the region, and I think we are still working. I mean, we are obviously still working our way through all of that, because uh, you did have a lot of people who were displaced. In the case of Assam, you had the loss of Sylhet, which was still then a part of Assam, and so the Sylheti Hindu population became homeless. They were not welcome on one side for their religion, and on the other side they had, they were not so welcome because of their language, and so that is something I think that began and continued to sort of play on anxieties for a long time. And uh, in the case of Tripura as well, definitely. I mean, the what I said earlier, the measuring and counting, the censuses, and the anxieties about representation, majorities and minorities. I think what I would also add is that you also basically you had the coming of the modern economy, you had the coming of modern education, which is a precursor to playing, to getting jobs, basically to having a good position in the modern economy. So the change of economic systems is also something which has to be taken into account, which is happening at the same time as all the rest of this is happening. And so the uh, relative uh, educational advantage of non-tribal populations in large cases over tribal populations, and probably of the Bengalis over the tribal populations, is something which happened because of historical factors. The British were there first in the plains and in Bengal, and but it was something which also would definitely have given rise to concerns, because basically you had a situation now where uh, people would see that a lot of Bengalis are coming in and they're going to dominate the jobs in the whichever state it is, and that is something that was definitely a concern for all the local populations. I think now, over the years, as educational advancements have happened everywhere, those differences don't exist anymore. The first mover advantage that the Bengali population had is no longer there, and you'll see it very simply. You look every year at the merit list of every state, and you'll see that it's the locals now who are usually at the top of the merit list or dominating the merit list in every state. So that anxiety, I think, has largely dissipated. It's not that way anymore. Uh, in in terms of jobs also, I think you've got reservations, at least for example in my home state of Meghalaya, very heavy reservation, very high reservations, and so those anxieties have, I think, largely been addressed, and hopefully those issues are largely at rest.
No, those are actually very interesting observations, including the the merit, the argument on merit, which I think shows as to how access to education has sort of in a way eased out a lot of these tensions that existed initially. But because you mentioned Meghalaya and because it's a home state, I mean I had to ask this question. Uh, with all of these political events that have happened in the Northeast over the years, one very unique one, although Assam was broken into many pieces over the years. The most unique one was probably the shifting of capital from Shillong to Guwahati. And Shillong has always been looked into as this very cosmopolitan city historically for this region as well. And so far as that, even Bhupen Hazarika had his songs written on it, right?
Yeah.
So, but my question is more on the side of language, because we know that one of the contributing factors to the statute of Meghalaya, at least the final nail in the coffin was the push for Assamese language. And language, I would like to know your views on this as well. That language in this region, in spite of the variety and the diversity in different languages that different communities speak, has always been a factor. For instance, let's say the pushing of Bengali in as an official language by the Britishers, where the Bengalis actually had nothing to do, but it was just an official language, or the pushing of Assamese in this case as an official language in the erstwhile Assam, which also included Meghalaya. So, how do you think these different factors, which end up becoming trigger points, have contributed to how this region looks today? What is your
Okay.
point of views on this?
Yeah. So I think I can start somewhere else
Yeah,
completely.
yeah,
So so basically, if you look at the old world, the world before the coming of nation states, you see language is not a factor at all
huh,
in terms of identity. So, for example, uh, you'll find that the Russian court is using French. You'll find that the British royal family is actually German, and that the Queen Victoria and her husband,
right,
whatever King Albert or whatever his name was, they're talking to each other in German. There, the name of the British royal family is actually the House of Saxe Coburg Gotha. They're basically of Germanic ancestry, and it is only at the coming of the First World War that they decide that okay, now we are at war with Germany, we can't be Germans anymore, basically. So so what I'm saying is that the issues of identity, of linguistic identity or similar identities did not matter in a world where the identity of the king or queen was what mattered, and the king or queen could in England could be German. That was not also a factor. People were loyal to the king or the queen or the royal house, and it was the persona of the king or the queen around which power congregated. So it's a different world. Whereas you gradually see a shift to two things. You get the idea of the nation state, which is basically what is the nation. The nation is a group of people who share a certain identity, and that identity may be a linguistic identity or an ethnic identity or even a religious identity. But the idea that such a group constitutes a nation, that they have a territory that they more than anybody else own,
right,
right? That they are the authentic people of that land, and the others don't belong, or belong but as second class citizens. Those
right,
are ideas which start coming in only late in the day, after the First World War in many cases. So you start seeing that sort of identity politics, and it becomes it proliferates and it spreads, and you have the sort of the creation of or the uh, emergence of that kind of state, in many cases after the fall of colonial empires, which again happens post First World War and post Second World War. So it's a process by which the Indian state emerges, Pakistan emerges, Bangladesh emerges. So Northeast India also, the idea that that a particular uh, linguistic identity belongs in a particular place and owns a particular territory more than others speaking different languages. You have to link it to the standardization of languages. Now, whether it is the Bengali language or the Assamese language or any modern language, they are modern languages. Modern language, people may claim, project back into history that, yeah, it's ancient. But actually, how far back can you push it? You'd probably find that in the form that we would understand the language as it is spoken today, the
right,
standard language. The standardization has happened maybe 300, 400 years ago. The first dictionaries and the first grammars definitely happen in the colonial period. You don't see the standard language, you can't have it before the coming of the printing press. So the printing press has to come first. So 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 these are all processes which have happened in the last 300, 400 years or less. And the emergence of the identities and the politics around those identities is something which has happened subsequent to, to that. And this is something which is there in both in the theory and in the observation, that yeah, this is how it happens. And so I think in the case of the Northeast, in state after state, you see the missionaries going in and standardizing languages. It happened in Bengal also. It was very similar here also in Bengal. And it's happened, it's a process by which the modern languages emerge, modern linguistic identities emerge, and then territorial notions of those identities are formed. You have the proliferation of the map, the printed map, which again cannot predate the existence of the printing press. So territory and identity, and of course after that, the notion of who a particular state belongs to. And it is something which is recognized even by the United Nations subsequently, that peoples have a right to self determination. You say it even now. So groups that see themselves as peoples, naturally they think that they have their own identity, and therefore they should have their own territory. So I think it is a process which has been ongoing for quite a while. But it has, in some sense, it has reached, it has hit its problems, for example in places like Manipur, where you have these overlapping claims of different groups.
One of the most interesting and fascinating things throughout our conversation today has been that, much like your book, we've heard you describe and talk in detail about how each state or each state within and the communities within have had different experiences, and together they've come together to form the union today. Albeit in for different reasons, for different reasons, their movements were fueled by different aspirations, and different communities had different historical ties, had different, and the way they interacted with each other also has caused the entire northeastern region to be formed the way it is. uh, as you said, it's very interesting that, my next question is something that you talked about just now. The fact that the idea of territory and community, although very different, are linked to each other because of the fact that territory is something that gives that community that sense of identity, that okay, we belong to this particular region, and that drives them forward. You have brought out this very interesting idea of by saying that, there are two ideas of India, Bharat and Hindustan, which remain in daily competition. So, if you could take listeners through what exactly your thought behind saying this, or what exactly do you think this daily competition between the idea of Bharat and Hindustan, the two ideas of India, are?
So I think actually that I would say it's not two but three: Bharat, Hindustan, and India. And and uh, each of these has its own uh, roots. So Bharat, of course, is from the Sanskrit root, and uh, it has a definite Hindu tone to it, history to it. Um Hindustan is a word which comes from Perso-Arabic roots, Persian and Arabic roots, and it was the name by which the territory was known, the country was known during Mughal rule. It is the name by which it is recognized even now. For example, on a visit to Turkey several years ago, I was asked if I was from Hindustan. So it is the name which is in use as far west as Turkey, maybe even now. Uh, India, of course, is a word which comes from Greek roots, and so therefore it has a Western connotation right from the beginning. And by the beginning, I mean the time of Alexander the Great, because
Mm-hmm.
So basically, right from inception, these are three ideas which have been uh, around, and often, in contention, because each of them has a distinct tone and uh, sort of uh, texture to the identity that comes with it. And so I think everybody would agree that the term Bharat has a more Hindu connotation to it, and is therefore also the name which is preferred by uh, our those who favor Hindu nationalism. Uh, the name Hindustan is something which historically was associated with the Mughals, and it has that sort of that uh, sort of Perso-Arabic root, so it has a different connotation. And India remains the Western idea of the country in some sense. It is also the uh, idea of a territory which has uh, sort of the strongest resonance with the Western educated and with those who would favor the tracing of the history in a direct line from British India rather than from ancient scriptures, for example, or epics. So I guess they are very different, and they are in contention even now. We see these debates even now about what the country is really and what it should be. And from 1947 to, so, a few years ago, it was definitely the idea of India which was prevalent, and now it seems that the times have changed. Uh, but those three ideas all remain. They remain, and they are still around. And because each of them, has probably a few 100 million people who are invested in each of these ideas, so they will probably remain around. You can't do anything that will remove one idea completely from contention. It will probably remain in some form or another.
And it's especially very interesting because you've traced the idea of Bharat and the way the terminology was used and the various connotations that it has had over the years in your book in great detail. So it was a very detailed way of exploring the idea of Bharat and also eventually how India and Hindustan as terms came to be. On that note, staying on the lines of identity, this is something that especially since we're a podcast from Northeast, we'd like to touch upon it a bit. Since we've talked about the uniqueness of the region and how the different communities in this region have experienced something that their experiences have been quite unique in terms of their integration to the with the Indian Union and the way kingdoms existed historically and how administration was done in this region. The question that comes with the Citizenship Amendment Act often is that why is it why is the idea so different in the way it is being discussed or being the way it's affecting states like northeastern states like Assam, and how the question of Citizenship Amendment Act affects or is being dealt with in the larger Indian context. So just could you just take us briefly through that a bit so that our listeners also get an idea of that.
Well, I mean, it was evident right from the beginning uh, that for the rest of India, the issue was one about the exclusion of Muslims, whereas for the Northeast, the issue was actually the inclusion of Bangladeshis, suspected Bangladeshis or people of Bangladesh origin. Uh, so the issues were completely different in the Northeast and in the rest of the country, and that was something which so many protests in the Northeast demonstrated. Protesters held up banners explaining,
Same.
what, saying what they were worried about. And so so basically, uh, that issue of migration has always been a hot potato in the Northeast, and the fear of being overwhelmed by large numbers of uh, people coming across from Bangladesh, whether they are Hindu or Muslim, is something which has always been around. So religion is not really the determinant as far as Northeast India is concerned. Uh, and to some extent, I am sympathetic with those concerns. I usually have avoided expressing my own opinions, both in my book and while speaking. But I think on this I have written extensively right from the beginning. I have always been concerned that even before it passed into law, and the first time I heard about it, I was concerned about the Citizenship Amendment Act and about the NRC as well. Now, I don't think one can be looked at without the other. In fact, our home minister famously said, "आप chronology समझिए." So, so, so we have to understand that there is in people's minds a connection between the two, and by people I mean not just ordinary people, but even people in power. There was a connection between the two, and NRC happened, and what happened after the NRC? Everybody rejected it. I can't think of any group which actually said, yes, we
This is
love
it.
it. This is it.
including
Everybody rejected.
the chief minister of now chief minister of Assam.
so, so it's very interesting that it satisfied nobody. So many thousands of crores were spent on the exercise. So many people, poor people, were further impoverished, and many
Hmm.
people died running from pillar to post trying to get their names in the list. And at the end, they're just going to put it in the dustbin. That is like putting 1600 crores, and I don't know how many people died, putting them all in the dustbin and then saying, let's do it again. So that was NRC. CA, who needs CA? According to India's existing citizenship laws, anybody can become a citizen by naturalization in 12 years. The major migrations which happened, the refugee migrations which happened in 1947 and 1971. By 1983-84, those people were already eligible for naturalization. So now I don't know, who is coming and how many people are coming. I have actually, because of my work on the Brahmaputra book, I have traveled on both sides of the border, and I have met people from the border security forces as well. And they're usually people from the states of North India, uh, who are posted there. And I've asked them that, do you see a lot of migration happening? And they've always been very clear that हाँ पहले होता होगा अभी नहीं होता है. So and I was not talking to them on record, so they were not compelled to say anything. I mean, these were informal conversations. So I don't know. I mean, I really don't know what is being achieved by doing all of this. Uh, I see, I see no practical applicability or very little practical applicability given the cost of both the NRC and the CA. So it creates tensions between communities. There is a human cost. There is a financial cost that the government is supposed to bear, and at the end of it, I'm not sure what has been achieved.
Yeah, another very significant, I think, point with the CAA is that anybody who wants to take the benefit of the CAA has to essentially first establish that they came from Bangladesh.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
which is also very contrary to what the
Uh-huh.
NRC wanted to establish. Of course,
Yeah.
given the cutoff date, because they, if, like you said, that most of the migration took place during a certain period. So I think that is the connection where I think the they need to resolve what they are trying to argue. So I think that is legally a very difficult point to challenge. But yeah.
Uh, on that note, it was really nice having you on our podcast, and we've started recording again, and it was really great that we could have such an interesting episode to start off things again for us as well. And congratulations on the book. We hope that more and more people get to go through it because it covers everything so interestingly, and I think I'm pretty sure if anyone just looks at the names, the way the chapters are named, they should be curious enough and end up reading the entire book. Thank you so much, Samrat. It was
Thank
really
you.
nice hosting you, and we hope to have you on future episodes of our podcast as well.
Thank you very much. Thanks,
Thank
Neil.
you.
Thanks, Animesh.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode of the Chicken Neck podcast, check out our other episodes available across all major streaming platforms and help us grow by spreading the word. And for more updates, do follow us on our social media handles.